And any podcast listeners that have these dogs, shame on you.
We're back.
BLTs.
BLT? Book Talk
What do we
Learn?
got this week? Who's
I
going
can
first?
go first if you guys want.
I like this.
Okay. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but I'm a vet. I have very strong opinions about brachiocephalic breeds. So this is why you should say Beau to Frenchies. And I originally I made this presentation and I listed like all of the brachiocephalic predisposed conditions, and it was like hours long. So I cut it down. But first, I'm sure you're all like, brachy say what? So mesocephalic, meso means medium, cephalic means head, is the shape of a normal head, such as you see here with the golden retriever. Then we have dolichocephalic, which means long head, and that's like a greyhound or a whippet. They have that long, narrow skull, like the skull's been stretched out, which doesn't really cause much problems. But then we have brachycephalic. Brachy means short, so we've got short heads over here. And if you can imagine taking your normal golden retriever skull and just squishing it this way, and then expecting that animal to be fine, then that's what you get when you get Frenchies.
That skull looks very painful.
That thing, you know what that looks like is, have you ever seen like those deep sea anglerfish things with a little thing on the front of it?
It totally does.
That's what that is.
Well,
is that actually what their teeth look like? They're
yes,
like,
yes,
ugh!
yes. So don't buy a brachycephalic dog. So if you're like, okay, well then what counts? Boxers are brachycephalic, pugs are brachycephalic, French Bulldogs, Boston Terriers, English Bulldogs. Those are kind of like the worst of the worst, which we see here on the left. In the middle, we have the normal head sizes, and then on the right, I have our dolichocephalic, so like greyhounds, whippets and stuff, collies. Okay, so like I said, there's a shit ton of problems, but I figured I'd go with the like big one that we associate with brachycephalic dogs and like kind of go over those complications and go step by step so you guys understand what's happening. So first we have BOAS, which stands for brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome. Over here we see a pug that it's listing all the different components of the syndrome and everything that basically goes wrong. But I'll break it down so it's a little simpler. So first, there's 3 basic congenital defects with BOAS, and what that means is they're born with some anatomical wrongness that they're kind of stuck with. So the first is stenotic nares. So nares are like your nostrils, and on the top left we have normal, and then you can see those nostrils get more and more closed, and that's what we mean by stenotic, that it becomes more narrow. And if you just like pinch your nostrils together and try to breathe, that's what our Frenchies are doing. Next, we get an elongated soft palate. So here is an x-ray of a normal dog. And the soft palate is this white opacity that's kind of thin, that's extending down to our hyoid apparatus. So that's the basihyoid, that's the bone that breaks when you hang someone. But you can see here that soft palate, it's just like a piece of soft tissue that separates your nasal cavity from your oral cavity. So air comes in this way into your trachea, and then below it is basically your mouth. With these brachycephalic dogs, you can see here they get way thicker, they get way longer. This is past our hyoid bones into our larynx, and that those gas-filled spaces I showed you earlier are absent. Like the nasopharynx is completely collapsed in this one, and you only have a little bit of gas in the oropharynx here. So that's bad. And then last, we get what's called a hypoplastic trachea, which basically just means a small trachea. But your trachea is your windpipe. That's this gas tubular structure coming down here. This is a normal dog. And our brachycephalic dogs, they're already allowed to have a normal trachea that is smaller. But then they also get an abnormally small trachea that looks like it's like a little ribbon of air trying to come through. It's like a little straw. So these dogs can't breathe through their nose. They barely can. Then they can't really get to the back of their throat because their soft palate's too long. And then once it gets into their trachea, there's like barely any room for it. So hence brachiocephalic airway syndrome. It is obstructing their airways. They can't breathe. And you think that would be bad enough, but no, it keeps going. So because their airways are obstructed, they have increased pressure when they try to breathe. And this causes weakening of the cartilages that support your airway system, and it also causes swelling of those tissues. So what does that look like? So first we get averted laryngeal saccules, which basically means these cartilages here, there's a vocal fold that has like a little pocket, like imagine like your pants pockets. And as that pressure increases, it's like turning those pockets out. And then that tissue that comes out gets swollen, boom. And we can see it here, how it's blocking that airway. That gets worse and worse. And eventually those cartilages, we call them the retinoid cartilages around here, that keep the airway open, they get more and more pressure on them and they get weak and they collapse to the point where every time you breathe, your entire airway collapses and you literally get no air in. And this is like end stage disease. Like you're kind of fucked at that point. These dogs are also prone to overheating because dogs don't sweat. So the way that they cool down is by evaporative cooling through panting. But you shorten their head. So their tongue, which is basically all the surface area they have to cool down, gets that much shorter. And there's less air moving through to be cooled down because they can't breathe. So they overheat. And then last, we'll talk about this separately, is gastroesophageal reflux disease and hiatal hernias. So this is basically like acid reflux. And then as a part of this condition, this x-ray shows a hiatal hernia. So what that means is like this white line is the diaphragm, and before that is all lung. And your stomach should sit here behind your diaphragm. But we see this circular thing here, which is your stomach saying, popping out of the diaphragm, saying, I'm going to be in the chest now, which is a problem. Okay, so here we have a normal Frenchie. A box is showing its esophagus going through the diaphragm into the stomach. But a lot of these dogs, like we said, we made them shorter. They get what's called a redundant esophagus, where the esophagus kind of has a pouch in the beginning that allows like fluid and food to just sit there. So if you just like imagine keeping food stuck in your throat, you're gonna want to get that out, and this causes them to regurgitate. So they kind of just go bleh, and then the food comes out, which as an owner, very annoying. But that's not it. Then, because like we talked about, you have all that increased pressure trying to breathe, it also sucks the stomach out through the normal hole in the diaphragm. So this is what we call a hiatal hernia. And a lot of times that's dynamic, so it'll go back and forth and back and forth. But when the stomach gets trapped in that hole in the diaphragm, it's like we've created a second pouch. And so any food or fluid that sits there, the dog also regurgitates. So while this isn't necessarily as like life-threatening as not being able to breathe, it is very annoying as an owner to just, you know, be at home and having all these piles of vomitus around to clean up.
Wait, so these dogs literally will just vomit regularly, typically.
Yeah, and technically there's a difference. So vomiting is a very active process where you're like, you know, and regurgitation is a very passive process. So it's just like, he could be going about his day, doing nothing, and then just goes, bleh, and it falls out.
Okay.
But yeah, this happens. It can happen pretty frequently. And then you can have side effects with your esophagus because, you know, you have all that acid. It's basically like acid reflux, heartburn and stuff. Okay, and then last we're going to talk about is a cleft palate, which is shown on the picture on the left. But and humans get this too, but basically you have the hard palate, which is the roof of your mouth, and then behind that's the soft palate, which we talked about before. And the cleft palate is just a hole either in one or both of those that connects your oral cavity with your nasal cavity. So when so basically again, we're smushing their face, and so their palates don't always align as they're developing, and that leaves this gaping hole. And when they're eating or drinking milk, that food can go through the hole into their nasopharynx, and then they breathe that in, which is bad. You don't want to breathe food into your lungs. That in combination with these dogs that regurgitate, if they're regurgitating, they can also breathe in some of that material as well, which means you're not only getting food, but you're getting like stomach acid and other things that you've now, whoopsie daisy, breathed into your lungs. And that sets them up for aspiration pneumonia. So this is a dog with aspiration pneumonia. The lungs should normally be black. I think it's probably easy to see on this 3D view, but you can see here on this side of the image, the lungs are all black. But then on this side, it's like a triangle of black, then a triangle of white, and a triangle of black. So that white is all fluid and cells and gunk in the lung. So these dogs who already can't breathe well, they're not getting a lot of oxygen. They finally get oxygen into their lungs, and they can't even use all of their lungs to exchange the oxygen into their blood because they have pneumonia. And because they can't breathe, it can take pretty extensive supportive care to treat these guys. They almost always need oxygen support because, you know, they can't breathe on their own very well. And I'm making this sound really bad. There are surgeries to help correct this, and the sooner you do it, the better. But, you know, you could also just adopt a dog that has a normal face. So that's my little rant on why you shouldn't have brachycephalic dogs.
This is very helpful.
So
Any question?
is there like a scale here, like on, you know, like is a French Bulldog more prone to this than like pug, or pug's the worst?
That's a great question. English Bulldogs are typically the worst, and Bulldogs are so bad that they can't even give live birth. If you want to breed a Bulldog, you have to plan a C-section because Bulldogs literally won't fit through their own hips.
Because they got giant heads or something?
Giant heads and small pelvises. And they also like those really like wide, stocky shoulders, you know, Bulldogs.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And any podcast listeners that have these dogs, shame on you.
they are very cute. I get that, but not my first choice, clearly.
This is the kind of stuff that's going to get people riled up on our social media platforms. We're going to get a lot of it's going to be good. All right. Well, this was good, guys.
This has been the Bookends. Bye, bye, bye.
Yeah, we just didn't end it. We just didn't end it.
Bye. Like,
See
comment,
ya.
subscribe.